and, welcome this evening to our class, and we'll be dealing with module 2. It focuses on ethical hacker as packaged by Cisco. This is part of the initiative to expose participants of this training to content that would improve your skill set. So please confirm that you can see my screen and let me know what it is you are seeing. I'm choosing to not mute everybody because I want to believe that
yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you.
We can see your screen. We can see the slide.
All right, thank you very much. Please, in the event that while I'm moving, the slide is not moving, please let me know so we don't face what we faced yesterday. So you're welcome this evening to planning and scoping the penetration testing assessment. Yesterday, we were able to define what the scope is. The scope would be an area of concern, particularly the area where you have been given approval to test. And with penetration testing, we are simply saying we are attempting to verify the validity of any system. Could be software, could be hardware, with the network infrastructure, as the case may be. Right. So other times the softwares could actually be broken into as many. Maybe an application software which is resident on a standalone device, could be network application, could be a web application, depending on whichever one it is. So I'm going to, again, as always, our attempt to give you components of every topic as we advance, because it puts everything into perspective. So I'm going to attempt to submit to you this evening planning and scoping, right, as regards penetration testing assessment. We're going to be looking at what I would call elements of, is it elements now, let's say components of or things to consider when you are planning and scoping a penetration testing assessment. Now, we have to understand from what we talked about yesterday that with regards to planning and or scoping a penetration testing assessment, it involves an approach, right, that is structured, right? And if it is structured, it must follow certain standards. We established that yesterday. What we're looking at here is to be able to look at those structured approach with the hope, right, to define, number one. Number two, prepare. Number three, ensure that the objectives, the requirements and boundaries of the test are clear. So this is what we're saying. In your defining a scope, in your preparing for that scope, and ensuring that the objectives or requirements of that particular scope or boundaries are very clear. That's exactly what we're looking at here, planning and scoping the penetration testing. So typically you're looking at an agreement that has to exist between you and whoever is engaging you for the service, or between you and whoever you are engaging for the service, right? So one of the first things you want to do is to define your goals. You have to understand the purpose of the test. Typically, are we looking at identifying vulnerabilities? Are we looking at improving security posture? Are we looking at fulfilling compliance requirements? All of these things must be defined. And very importantly, I said something yesterday, there must be a policy for your organizations. Unfortunately, we don't have. The hope here is that all of you who are in this particular training, who belong to perhaps different organizations, have to go back and insist on this for your organizations, because it's like having a constitution for a country or for a state or a nation state, right? Or having an objective for an organization as regards the plan, having a mission plan and all of those. So it's very, very important. Whatever you are doing here as regards penetration testing or planning the penetration testing or planning and scoping the penetration testing, you have to first of all identify that you understand the purpose of the test, right? If perhaps you're looking at, if there are weaknesses within the system you want to test, which is vulnerabilities, you accept that. You want to improve your security posture for the network, you want to do that, you indicate, right? Or perhaps you also want to fulfill compliance. You're setting compliance based on some standards, like I mentioned yesterday. Unfortunately, or is it fortunately, or let's put it this way, you may observe that most of the standards we'll be capturing here are abroad. However, the beauty of this is that we're exposing you to global standard. It is also possible that perhaps you're part of an organization, a particular professional body. What we're hoping that you do through that organization is to drive some certain type of replicating some of these standards within our client so that it can actually be applicable here. As it stands right now, there's a GDPR, which is the global data protection right. We have ours here in Nigeria. Kudos. We also have the Cybersecurity Act 2015. It's here. So these two are the ones that I know I'm familiar with. There are quite a number of them who are still perhaps in committee stage or perhaps even in discussion stages. But eventually, we hope to see the light of day, particularly in this era where things are beginning to move so much online. Right? So if there's a policy for your organization, such organization, then of course, whatever you are defining as it regards the objectives and goals must align to your policy. And remember that your policy captures your business needs, right? That's one. Number two, that one of the components, like I said, is to define objectives and goals. The second objective, or let's say element of planning and scoping and penetration testing, is to define your scope. We established that yesterday. It sounds like an objective, but it sounds like defining objective and goals. No, your objective and goals is respect to your company policy, or perhaps let's say your business needs, right? Whereas the scope is simply defining, or you are trying to identify specific systems or specific network applications or specific data that is to be included in your test. So you are simply telling the person whose services you are engaging, or they are telling you because they're engaging your service that, hey, this is our scope. We're looking at these specific systems, perhaps our FTP, perhaps our HTTP, maybe it's our web server, could be maybe, our AAA server, and so on and so forth, right? So typically you are defining all of this, and you should choose to, within these definitions of what you're as regards the scope, you perhaps may also want to include or exclude certain services which you consider critical systems within your organization. That's number two. The third thing you want to look at is rule of engagement. What do we mean here? Like, this is the rule that will guide the testing. So is it going to be during working hours? Should it be during weekends? We have a knack in this part of the world of just offing the network. Most network guys have that how do I put it now? Perhaps it's because people have not really sued. You get my point? You can just wake up and the network is down, and they can just tell you that network is bad. We don't know what to do about it. But as long as you are giving people services, yes.
Excuse me, sir. Are we expecting the slide to be moved in place? Because
No, I'll let you know.
Okay,
That means you
so
didn't hear me at the beginning. At the beginning, I said,
okay.
well, first of all, laying the scope as regards planning and scoping and penetration testing, right? We're looking at the objectives or elements that are contained or should be contained within planning and scoping and penetration testing assessment. So first, I said, we have to first of all define our objective and goals. Then number two, we need to define our scope. So right now I'm speaking on rules of engagement, and I was trying to explain how that we should identify at what time of the day this testing should happen. Should it be during work hours? We establish those rules. Should it be work hours? Should it be after work? Should it be weekend? I would always propose, right? If it's not a production network, you don't do any of your testing on a production network. We established that yesterday, that it's advisable that you have some sort of lab, right? And then on that lab, test everything before you bring it to the production network. But in the event that you're going to now do it on the production network, now that you've testified or you've been able to ascertain and disrupt production, right? And production could be practically anything. If you're doing that for a bank, what you want to identify, what would be the level of disruption that we can tolerate. If you've done networks before now, one of the things we hope to achieve within networks is say, we want to have 99.9999 uptime. Now that's crazy. For those of you who've been into networks, you agree with me that 0.1, because if you add 0.1, it adds up everything to 100. 0.1 of that whole what's it called, scope can mess up your entire network, because it could just happen at a critical time where people have problems, right? So that's one. That's number 3. Rules of engagement. Identify when testing should happen. Is it work hours or is it not work hours? And also agree, very importantly, the tools that you'll be using. Because remember we said yesterday that what makes you ethical is that you communicate to the person who's engaged your service what tools you'll be using. Of course, you might have convinced him that this tool has worked in XYZ place. This tool is against the backdrop of XYZ standard, and so on. Right? So the person is convinced about it. Right? So another thing you want to identify is to within your scope, who are the stakeholders? Right? All of these are captured here, but I'm trying as much as possible to lay this. Then we can now dive into the slides and see how that happens. Who are the stakeholders? Right? Perhaps what should the communication line going to be like? Phone calls, text messages, right? Who are the people that we're going to talk about? Do we need the legal team of the organization to identify? We're getting to a place where a lot of IT things are becoming tenable. I hope you all know that a post on Twitter can actually be brought as is it evidence they call it now? Yes, in court. It's tenable now. A WhatsApp message is tenable, right? Because you see, digital receipts from your banks are also now tenable in the event that you cannot provide, excuse me, a fiscal receipt or perhaps a fiscal teller, right? So what you want to do is set up a clear channel for real-time communication. What do we do? Phone calls. What communication should happen? Is it 2 hours? Whether we have done it or not, at some time, people should be notified. You may notice that this is very, very popular for particularly Cisco sites. As we speak, they are going through some form of maintenance. It started from yesterday. Today is Saturday. And they are hoping to last. That's supposed to happen till, I think, mid-afternoon our time, early morning their time, depending on where their server is. So what you want to do is to be able to identify the stakeholders. And this is for the purpose of communication. Perhaps IT guys should be involved. Perhaps security guys should be involved. You want to establish a clear line of communication. So stakeholders, identify them, and also identify communication. Then with regards to legal, we must also identify that there must be legal considerations as regarding planning and scoping and penetration testing. What you want to identify is to obtain proper authorization so that you're able to perform your test and ensure that all permissions are documented. I was at a meeting earlier this morning and somebody did some disbursement and said it verbally, wrote it down, but then he didn't provide certain receipts. And I was shocked that the person was actually termed as someone who has financially misappropriated funds. And it was shocking, but see, he didn't provide proof. There was no proof. So whatever legal documents you have that gives you a backing to do this, right, it is very, very important that you obtain proper documentation, right? Whether there are regulatory issues, any requirement regarding data privacy laws, and so on, industry standards, ensure that you obtain them. You can see why it is very, very important, which is why I was saying earlier that in the event that you get engaged or get exposed to tools, please make sure that those tools are not what you use anyhow, right? Number 6, ensure that you identify for the various stakeholders. What you want to ensure is assign roles and responsibilities to the team that is going to be working with you and also to the stakeholders. Use stakeholders. This is what we expect you to do. Please log on at so hour or log off at so hour. Please use this application at so hour because we are trying to test this application. You guys, the testing guys, this is the period you're going to do this. Do it between 7 and 10 a.m. depending. This is going to be stuff you sit down and have a conversation about, right? And then with regards to any form of risk that may arise, potential risk to the systems, to the protocols, whatever, you must identify a safe mechanism, right, in the event that they are affected. Risk management or risk assessment and management, okay, or let's call it risk assessment and mitigation, so how to come out of it. Then there must be timelines. You must have a timeline milestone. By this time, we should have done this. By 2 hours, we should have done this. This is in line with communication, right? Number 9, report and documentation. This is one thing that we in this part of the world have a big problem with, right? We don't know how to report. And by the way, there's actually another aspect of reporting as regards IT issues, particularly penetration testing. I think somewhere in the future, we're going to look at it, perhaps maybe next week, by maybe Friday or Saturday. I'm not sure which of the days now. Then in the event that we're done, lastly, when we're done, there must be a post-assessment follow-up. After documentation, must be a post-assessment follow-up, which is a brief session where you sit down with stakeholders and review or perhaps revise what has been done. Now, these are the components of any planning and scoping, right? Particularly with reference to penetration testing. Okay, so now that we've been able to get that out of the way, let's dive into the course. At some point, I'm going to help explain what we regard governance, risk, and compliance. We'll deal with that as we advance. So let's dive into the course content now and see how much you can achieve tonight, right? So I'm sure you can see that my slide is moving now. I'm beginning to move my slide now. Are we good? Is it showing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Somebody, your name is Zoom user. Your hand has been up. You have a question? Somebody is Zoom user. Your hand is up. I don't know whether it's by mistake because it looks like you want to ask a question. As long as that hand is up, I always think that you want to ask a question. So let's move on. So planning and scoping and penetration testing assessment. In this module, are going to be looking at the model objective here is to create penetration testing preliminary documents. Or ultimately, that's what we're hoping to achieve, right? So let me see. I can hide this. Yeah, great. That doesn't affect. All right, super. So 3 things that what we're going to be looking at: comparing and contrasting governance, risk, and compliance concept. I'm going to try to explain that much later, explaining how governance, risk and compliance, and environmental factors in planning penetration testing. Explain the importance of scoping and organizational or customer requirements. This is where we create a penetration test scope and plan documents that address the specific requirements for organizations as regards pen testing, right? Could be a particular service, a product, it could be a product. So it could be software, the hardware, the network infrastructure, and so on. Then lastly, we're going to look at demonstrating an ethical hacking mindset by maintaining professionalism and integrity. That is where you look at creating your personal code of conduct to provide professionalism and integrity in your own ethical hacking practice. So let's dive straight into it and see how far we can go. So let's start with the first part, comparing and contrasting governance, risk, and compliance concept. Now, one of the most important phases, if not the most important, of any penetration testing engagement is the planning and penetration preparation phase. Now, I think somebody said somewhere that if you fail to plan, you have planned to fail, right? Sounds very good. And it happens to us all every now and then. Different people actually have that regard certain projects that they're engaging. Some people have a way of just pulling it off. They just jump off at a thing and then they do it on the go. Makes sense. But remember that what you are doing is penetration testing. And of course, it's on someone's environment, somebody's infrastructure. So there's going to be a need to sit down and plan it. Matter of fact, if anybody is going to take you serious or seriously, it is important to do that. Now, during the phase of the planning and preparation, you clearly scope your engagement. Remember, we define scope as the area that you have permission to do your testing on. So you have to sit down and clearly scope it, identify what you're going to do. If you do not scope correctly, you will run into issues with your client, or they may run into issues with you, right? If you work as a consultant, or with your boss, if you are part of a corporate red team. We're going to deal with this red team and blue team later. We'll categorize the people who are in this particular penetration testing. Who are the red team guys? Who are the blue team guys? Right? And you might even encounter legal problems. So remember, I've been able to lay those foundations at the beginning. Legal things need to be taken care of. If there's a legal department in that particular organization, find out from them the implication of most of these kind of things. If there aren't, then of course you find out the regulations that exist in your region for this kind of thing. So a red team is a group of cybersecurity experts and penetration testers hired by an organization to mimic a real threat actor by exposing vulnerabilities and risk regarding technology, people, and physical. So these ones leaving the organization. Their job is to defend the organization against cybersecurity teams. So good guy, bad guy, or good cop, bad cop. Okay. So if I ever engage you to test or find out how tough my network is, you are a red team. But if you're an employee of my organization and your job is to counter what the guy is doing, then you are in the blue team. Okay. So perhaps it's people like your computer security incident report team, your InfoSec guys, your security operation center analysts, and all of those guys. So whoever the name is that they give to them, these are like standard names that we have around. So whoever you are, if you are hired by the organization, you're in the blue team. If you're an employee of the organization, you're in the blue team. If I hire you and you're an outsider, not a member of my organization, then you are in the red team. So this is a thing to note. So once we talk about red team, blue team, I wish we were actually physically in a particular place so we can just split ourselves into two and see what happens with regards to red team and blue team. So let's dive in. Now, some key concepts you must address and understand in the planning and preparation stage. Number one, target audience, right? The rule of engagement, the communication escalation path and communication channels, the available resources and requirements, the overall budget for the engagement, which includes people, resources, and money. When I say resources, I'm looking at tools, right? People, tools, and the money. These are the things you need to look at. Then the overall budget for the engagement. And are there any specific disclaimers? Legal issues now, that is. Any technical constraints, right? Network, light, resources available to you as a penetration tester, which are your tools. So I've been able to outline this at the beginning in my opening remark to this topic. I outlined all of this. Right. Now, there are regulatory compliance issues. You must be familiar with several regulatory compliance considerations in order to be successful in ethical hacking and penetration testing. So I mentioned this. I said some of them perhaps all of these things are global, right? We may begin to have, as time goes on, representations of this in here. Like, we have ISOC, we would have a state chapter perhaps, or perhaps even have a Nigerian chapter, okay? So that's what I'm trying to say. So not only to complete compliance-based assessment, but also to understand that regulations will or may affect you and the person you are working with, whether it's somebody you are engaging or somebody who engaged your service. Okay, so these are certain regulations that we have, and this is a description of what they do. If you observe, some of them actually capture United States, like I mentioned earlier, but because I think, for example, in there's one of them that requires that is a mandatory. It's a New York something. We're going to get to it. Let me not jump ahead of myself. Right. So for those of us who use what we call ATM cards, right? That's a payment card industry. There is a regulation that aims to secure any form of card, right? I heard that we don't have credit cards. Guy, is dependent on the money you have. You get how your money go reach, they will give you credit card. If you don't get, you get debit card so that you can just do day before you go chop past what you're supposed to do. Well, the payment card industry data security standard aims to secure the processing of credit card payments and other types of digital payments. So you see, we didn't just wake up to start using cards online. There was a regulation which allowed that because there's a lot of compliance issues. What if I punch in my card and somebody wipes all my money? What if somebody has something within the site that is actually capturing information, perhaps card number and perhaps my CVV or CUV or CV2, whatever the numbers are, right? So that's one. This is with regards to the payment card industry, all the payment card. We have them, credit card, debit card, whether they are Visa, Verve, or MasterCard, any of those guys. Then there's HIPAA or HIPAA. This is more or less health insurance portability and accountability. It's becoming a main thing, especially these days in our part of the world where we have a lot of what they call them now, health administrators who are like a go-between hospitals, pharmacies, and also and patients, people who have health challenges. The original intent of these guys, right, was to establish a regulation to simplify and standardize healthcare administrative processes. So typically, making it simple, right? Where paper records and transaction to electronic records are shifted. So paper transaction are shifted to electronic records. It's beginning to happen for most of the teaching hospitals in our country, where a lot of them are beginning. I think there's some team around. I think it was a nationwide something. It started sometime, I think it was early this year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. In the state where I reside, the state hospital looked at doing that, but they're looking at certain budget constraints, and it was they just put it on hold for a while. It may come up very soon. More or less having what we call an EMR, electronic medical record, right? So typically, the biggest challenge here is getting people's records, because if I have your information as regards who you are and your medications, then I can do something to you. But the point is, if I'm giving you my record, what are the regulations that guard me as a person? Okay, so even if I'm doing penetration testing, for example, for that kind of organization, understand that there are regulations for it. Okay, so this is the United States Department of Health and Human Services was instructed to develop and publish standards to protect an individual's electronic health information, what we call EHI, right? They are part of your PIIs. PIIs are personally identifiable information. So your electronic health information is part of it, while permitting appropriate authorities to have access and use of that information. Those authorities are healthcare providers and other entities that are related. So maybe there's somebody faints, God forbid, person faints somewhere. Person is perhaps a resident of Sokoto, and the person faints somewhere in let's say Lokoja, right? And the person is rushed to a hospital. With the network of information that we have, we can access those data and be able to administer whatever the person has. Maybe the person has an underlying challenge. So we're able to recover history of the said person. Then there's FedRAMP. This is for the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program for cloud service offering. And this is a US thing. Okay, so do we have one? Well, as it stands today, most of our services are actually not hosted in our country. Most of our guys are hosting it outside. So where those services are hosted, they are guided and bound by this law or this particular regulation, as it were. So should we start offering those services mainstream? Of course, we must find laws that are within here. This is why people who are within this particular community, this that I'm talking to right now, must begin to participate in organizations or communities where these regulations are looked at. Because if you are part of policy making, when it eventually becomes a law, you know that, of course, your stake or your interest is captured because you are a representative of the community, right? So regulatory issues are very, very important. Most of these regulations and specifications require the regulated company to hire third-party penetration testing firms to make sure they are compliant and to ensure that their security posture is acceptable, right? It goes back to also say, after a while, when I begin to have organizations that ratify certain people to say, this person is a qualified pen tester, not just this one that somebody went to write certification exam somewhere and is now gang. As far as we're concerned, the person is more or less a hacker, but not an ethical one. So you must be familiar with these regulations if you are hired to perform penetration testing to verify compliance and the overall security posture of the organization. Many of these standards provide checklists, as it were, of the items that should be assessed during a penetration testing engagement. You must also become familiar with the different privacy-related regulations, such as GDPR. That's the general, sorry, I called it global earlier, my error. Well, it focuses on global, but it's just general data protection regulation. Okay, we have our own, hooray, in Nigeria, we have our own NDPR. Now, that document or that particular compliance document includes strict rules around the processing of data and privacy. If students of schools, people who just jam entry, okay, I shouldn't have, well, JAMB, SSC, admissions into universities, hospital matters, election matters, national identity, NIMC, national, what's NIMC? I've forgotten, or NIMC, right? Those people, right? There are certain regulations, because if I'm having to register or give you certain details that are mine, what are the guarantee that I have that those information are safe? We have things like NIN number, right? We have things like our BVN number. We have things like our VIN. There's voters identity VIN, identification number. They will also have your driver's license number. All of those things are stuff that every now and then somebody can take. So to a point where it won't be proper for a law enforcement agent to just collect your card just like that and they say I've seized it, right? And so on. So there are actually rules, there are guidelines within there. One of the GDPR's main goal is to strengthen strengthen and unify data protection for individuals within EU while addressing the export of personal data outside of EU. So this has been scaled down. So that is also contained within our NDPR, Nigeria's data protection regulation. The primary objective of GDPR is to give citizens control of their personal data, not to give any organization, right? So you can walk into a bank or walk into any organization and demand certain compliance because they are duty bound by certain compliance regulation or regulatory compliance considerations to ensure that you're attended to, right? So regulation in the financial sector is a big one too. Financial services institutions such as banks, credit union, LAPO them, LAPO and the rest of them, and lending institutions provide an array of solutions of financial instruments. Customers and transactional information is the heart of their business. So if a customer is there and his information is with you, then you better behave carefully, right? Protection of customer information is necessary to establish and maintain trust between financial institutions and the community that they serve. More especially, institutions have a responsibility to safeguard the privacy of individual consumers and protect them from harm, including fraud and identity theft. You have certain cases that you go to a bank and then you are told that did you use your card online, and then you are the cause. It is you. You went to a particular site and there's a particular bank I hear that a lot of people are having issues with. Most people who bank with them are people who stay abroad, so they send in money, and for some reason they have money stacked there for a long period. And these guys observe that these monies are coming from a particular part of the world, and so they begin to just loot their money and scam it. When you talk, they'll tell you, if you do a purchase and it is 30,000 naira, they will just collect 300k. So I know maybe it's your error. Okay, provide the information that shows all of this is down. So all of these regulations are there. We are still not very there in this country because everything is still handled by police, right? I feel like the law enforcement agents should have all of these units resident within them to be able to deal with all of this. Since they're empowered by law to be law enforcement agents, we should have some of this is resident in their place. Now, on a broader scale, the industry is responsible for maintaining the critical infrastructure of the nation's financial services, basically, right? That's financial sector. Then examples of regulations to the financial sector are, again, please note, some of these things are perhaps not, I'm not very familiar with the financial sector and the regulations that are there, but this is, again, remember I said that earlier, this is with respect to United States. Some of them can be scaled down. Some of you might even do some research and find out which ones guide on this. Title V, Section 501B, Graham-Leach-Bailey Act, it's called GLBA, and the corresponding interagency guidelines. There's Federal Financial Institution Examination Council. I think we have this. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, yeah, we have this. As NDIC, right? We have NDICs. It safeguards, that's Safeguard Acts and Financial Institution Letters, FILs. The New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Regulations, NYDFS Cybersecurity Regulation 23, NYCRR Part 500. Compliance with some regulations, such as the New York Department of Financial Services is mandatory in that part of the world, right? So just to note. Now, that document defines a lot of all of this, typically focusing on check cashing businesses, payday lenders, mortgage brokers, and the rest of them. This law applies to companies that receive information about customers of other financial institutions, including credit card reporting agencies and ATM operators. So bottom line, whatever institution or organization or sector you fall under, there are regulations that guide them, okay? So find out what those regulations are and then be able to identify as a pen tester. If they call you to do work, find out first, what are the compliance? If they don't know, then let them know. If they don't know and you let them know they don't want to hear, get legal backing. If they team no work, God will open another door, you do another work before you come and be greeting you from Kirikiri prison, right? The Federal Trade Commission is responsible for enforcing GLB as it pertains to financial firms that are not covered by federal banking agencies. Now, the reason why I'm usually very skeptical about reading all of this, because this what you have on your screen is is based in the United States. I said this earlier that a great number of these things are perhaps not applicable here. If they are, then we'll have our own variation here. Okay. So in the event, the bottom line of this is in the event that you have to do any kind of work for these people, find out what the regulations are, and then you'll be able to deal with them. So everything, I'm going to skip this slide because they're all New York, America level, and they explain some of this. But please read them because they will help you in answering the questions that are in the examination. So we have a healthcare sector. There's for those of us who are in, I don't know about some other states because I've not traveled to verify some of this. We have a particular scheme happening here which is called Plus Chema. I think it's Plateau State Health something. So there's some form of collaboration that's already happening with regards to what's it called now? What this health intervention by that allows what's it called? Oh, help me. I've forgotten. I had it in my head though. Now I'm about to explain that I forgot. Please pardon me. I'll remember. Right. But there are more or less HMOs, right, with regards to NHIS. That's what I was trying to remember. I think they said the name has changed from NHIS to something. Is it NHIA or so? I'm not sure. But as it stands today, you can imagine
NHIE.
NHIA, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So typically it's health insurance. That's just what it is. Being able to access healthcare, right, at a budget that is subsidized. So there's a percentage you contribute, there's a percentage the government contributes. And so to be able to ensure that you get the best of it, an agency comes in between and mediates, or perhaps just stands in between and be able to appropriate. So there are certain levels of healthcare that you want to access that is not available, because it's not captured within that scheme, because perhaps it's too expensive, in which case you have to pay, and all of those. But then there's a sector for that. Now, that sector has certain rules or regulations with regards to compliance, because otherwise, then we'll do people anyhow. So on February, this is for United States now, on February 20, 2003, the Security Standard for the Protection of Electronic Protected Health Information, known as HIPAA Security Rule, was published. The security rule requires technical and non-technical safeguards to protect electronic health information. Now, with this campaign going on around the country, where most hospitals, particularly government-owned hospitals, right? When I say government, state government or federal government-owned hospitals, are beginning to migrate their records to become electronic, there's going to be a need for this to be reviewed or perhaps scaled down for our country. Because if for some reason there's a violation of the details that you have there of any, or let's say there's not a violation, so maybe there's a breach, there's going to be a problem. There's going to be a serious problem, right? So here are certain things that it looks at. The scope and requirements of the security rule include 2009 Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, which is known as HITECH. It's 2009 Breach Notification Rule, 2013 modification to the Hyper-Privacy Security Enforcement and Breach Notification Rule under the HITECH Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. That act get one kind come up. So somebody can come in and tell you that identify as a man and the person is a girl, and you don't have the right to discriminate. So there are certain kind of diseases that some hospitals can tell you that I cannot treat here. I can go and sue and tell them they discriminated against me and so on. These are certain compliance rules, because as long as you're giving services, there are some rules. Now, why are we looking at all these guidelines? Because in the end, the relationship that exists with these organizations, right, all of these sectors, is with clients, and these clients have certain information. And should you be called upon to do some form of test or penetration testing for them, you must scope it and identify that these regulations guide this. Are you in compliance? If you are not, then let's comply. If you are not, let's get legal documents and have everything sorted out, right? So HHS has published additional cybersecurity guidelines to help healthcare professionals be able to defend against security vulnerabilities, ransomware, and modern cybersecurity threats. So the HIPAA rule focuses on safeguarding electronic protected health information, or called EPHI, or PHI, protected health information. Then there's also identifiable health information. I said that earlier, that any information that has to do with your private identity is considered your PII, personally identifiable information. So bottom line, we're looking at regulations that protect of this information. The security rules applied to cover entities and business associates. Covered entities include healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, CHUs, that's community health extension workers, midwives, and the rest of them. Health plans, whatever plan you have, like one of the health plans we have in Nigeria is the NHIA, healthcare clearing houses, and certain business associates. All right, all of them are captured there. So for healthcare providers, the person or an organization that provides patients or medical services such as doctors, clinics, hospitals, outpatient services, counseling, nursing, nursing homes and hospice services, pharmacy services, medical diagnostics and imaging services, and durable medical equipment. The healthcare plan are typically entities that provide payment for medical services or perhaps even regulate those services that people engage, like healthcare insurance companies, HMOs, government health plans or government programs that pay for healthcare, such as Medicare, Medicaid, military, and veteran programs. I was having a conversation with a military person the other time, and they were trying to look at how they can begin to incorporate a way for the military to be taken care of, because a great number of them actually suffer a lot of trauma and are just left alone. And you have cases where most of them actually leave service and they go back and start living with civilians, and integrating with civilian life is usually very tough. So health plan is actually part of what covers that as well. Healthcare clearinghouses are entities that process non-standard health information and that they receive from other entities into a standard format. So usually people that convert records into electronic records. Then the business associates are people, of course, who are initially defined as persons or organizations that perform functions as business, basically, that involves the use of personal health information or disclose personal health information, maybe for research purposes and the rest of them. Okay, so those are the guys. So payment card industry standards, those are the financial guys. In order to protect cardholders against misuse of their personal information and to minimize payment and channel losses, the major payment card brands, that's Visa, MasterCard. We don't have Discover here, right? We don't have America Express here. So the ones that we have here are Visa, MasterCard, Verve, right? I think Opay and the other guys have theirs. I don't know which of the cards they form under. But all of them there's an industry that they all belong to, right? There's a Payment Card Industry Security Standard Council. And they developed the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard called PCI DSS. And it must be adopted by any organization that hopes to transmit or process or store payment cards, information about payment card, or perhaps deal indirectly or directly with security card holder data. So any organization that leverages on a third party to manage cash holder data has the full responsibility of ensuring that that card holder or that particular organization is compliant with that payment card industry data security standard, right? So please, if you're in the call and your microphone is on, can you mute it so that when we go back to reading this, it won't have this interference. Maybe what I'll start doing now is going forward, I'll just mute everybody at the beginning of the meeting so that we don't have this interference. Some of you forget that your microphone is on, right? So for the PSI DSS, there are some people that need, these are certain terms, right? So number one, we have acquirer, we have the approved scanning vendor, we have the merchant, we have the primary account number or PAN, we have the payment brand, we have the forensic and investigator. So the acquirer is more or less the bank, the industry, the organization or financial institution as an entity that initiates and maintains relationship with merchants for the acceptance of payment cards. So perhaps we can have, in our own case, InterSwitch or maybe certain banks, because some banks have theirs. I think we have, which of the bank now has their own payment gateway as well. Okay, so let's say we can say it's either most of the banks, of course, in collaboration with InterSwitch, right? Then we have the approved scanning vendor or ASV. It's an organization approved by PSI to conduct external vulnerability scanning services. So more or less, should we have this organization or this particular body here or this component here, in this country. If you plan to do pen testing for financial institutions, you have to be approved by these guys. You must belong there. Then there's a merchant. The merchant is any entity that accepts payment card bearing the logos of any of the members of the PSI. So in our case, who is our merchant in Nigeria? We can say InterSwitch, right? So they more or less are the ones who allow payments, card payments, right? So you can actually go to a particular place. As it's great now. Can you imagine when it started? It was bad. At some point, Visa can only receive money from Visa. MasterCard was more or less the one who could receive from everyone. When you come to a particular shop and you're about to buy something, you pull out your card, you say, okay, this one a Visa. Okay, please, don't you have cash? Can you do transfer? Okay, please go outside and withdraw money and pay. But it's way better now. Then there's a PAN. PAN is a 19-digit long number which identifies your own. I don't know what our card numbers are. I think ours is 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's 20. Especially the ones on MasterCard. I think it's Verve that is longer, right? So these are more or less your primary account number. Is a payment card number that is up to 19 digits long. Then the payment brands such as, again, these other ones, Visa, MasterCard, Verve, in our own case, Verve, and perhaps the ones that we have. Then there's the person that is trained and certified to investigate and contain information about cybersecurity incident and breaches involving cardholder data is your forensic investigator. Okay. I would say that forensics should also be part of the skills in ethical hacking. So there's a QSA, which is a qualified security assessor, more or less somebody who's been trained and certified to carry out compliance assessment. You can imagine some kind of certification that you need to write, to be able to be in this category. Imagine if you do now money man, they pay you good money. You can be going to Brussels or maybe go and chill in Brunei and come back. Then the service providers are usually a business entity that is not a payment brand that is directly involved in the processing, storage, or transmission of cardholder data. This includes companies that provide services and control or cloud or could impact the security of cardholder data, such as managed service providers and provide managed firewalls. So again, this is another role that our InterSwitch guys fall into, right? To be able to counter the potential for staggering losses, the payment card brands contractually require that all organizations that store, process, or transmit cardholder data and or sensitive authentication data comply with PSI and DSS. And the requirement apply to all systems component that account data is stored, processed, or transmitted. So you can imagine the regulations within banking. I'm very sure that maybe we didn't know some of this existed for our sector. Okay, so these are the sensitive data, authentication data that we have, right? Your PAN, which is a primary account number. Some banks have it here now. Some of them have it on request. Full magnetic stripe data or equivalent data on a chip. What we have mostly is data on a chip. Some of them have few have magnetic cards, right? So the requirements apply to all system components that account data is stored, processed, or transmitted. More or less any sensitive data, right? Account data that consists of your details, right? Any sensitive authentication data, my name, my PIN, right? All of those things, they must be responsible for it. The organizations have some compliance to these regulations. If the PAN is not stored, processed, or transmitted, PSI DSS requirements do not apply. Okay, and it applies in most cases because my ATM card cannot work outside my bank connection. So there's a cardholder name. Okay, so you have things like they contain your CAV2, CVC2, CVV2, CID. All of this is our identity of the cardholder. Then you have your expiration date, which is more or less your personal identification number, and then a block. Okay, so if cardholder name, service code, and or expiration date are stored, processed, or transmitted with a PAN or are otherwise present in the cardholder data environment, they too must be protected. So as regarding the standard, the account number, right, must be stored in an unreadable encrypted format because it is a sensitive information. So authentication data may never be stored post authorization if encrypted. So typically, if it's been encrypted, then of course don't keep it. Let it just be a one time. That's part of why we now have one time. You know, there was a time when you could do transaction without even having to verify. If somebody had your card, punched in the number on a particular site, the person could do purchase. But now, especially if the person knows your PIN, apart from just knowing the PIN and also knowing the card number, there would definitely be a one-time password that is sent, which is only usable for that one time. So there are algorithms and formula for the industry algorithm that is used to validate different identification numbers. We have like your IMEI, which is what we call phone.
There is no answer. Hello?
So we can hear you. Can you guys hear him?
I think he's off. It's not in the call again.
I think his network.
I think his network is offline.
Okay. We can hear you clearly, sir.
Thank you. Apologies, I don't know what happened.
There's no problem.
I just got logged out. Okay, so let me share. So you can see my slide now.
No problem, sir. Welcome.
All right,
Yes,
good.
sir.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I can see.
All right, so thank you. Apologies, I don't know what happened. This kind of things are expected, especially when we're using digital platforms. It could just happen every now and then. Okay, so more or less what I was trying to say earlier was the fact that it is very important that this regulation or the compliance are considered. So that's why we said earlier that you have to first of all you have to identify. When I was laying the foundation at the beginning, of the class, before the class started, I was explaining how that in planning and scoping, you have to define objective and goals, then, define your scope, then identify rules of engagement, and very importantly, I think that was number 4 point, I think, that was identifying your stakeholders, where you identify so these are the stakeholders. So this is citing certain examples for different organizations. So this is with respect to financial organizations, right? And as long as those organizations have to interact with customers, and those customers' information is there, we've identified health, we identified bank, financial sector, and so on, right? We also identified card holders, particularly card organizations that use PCI cards. That's cards that hold information that contain personal data of people. You must identify the compliance that is binding to them. So I don't know, as a disclaimer or a caveat, please realize that most of what we're going to be capturing in this course, remember that it is not a course domiciled here in our local country, but then the content is actually as potent as anything that can be around any part of the world. So the hope is that people who are in this particular class would begin to participate in organizations or agencies or associations who perhaps may want to spearhead the I don't know how to call it now, the creation or perhaps even the publishing of some of these regulations within our country. Okay, so very important. So let's go on. Typical elements on the front of a credit card, you know all of this. For every card that you have, there's embedded microchip. That's what is most popular here. Then there's also your number, your account number. That's a PAN. Then there's an expiration date, and then there's a cardholder's name. All of these are there. So these are based on standards. So any card that anybody is giving that doesn't have this thing is questionable. The microchip contains the same information as the magnetic stripe, and this is dependent on the organization giving it. Now, this microchip we talked about could be a magnetic stripe that is on magnetic strip that is on most of those cards. So most non-US cards have a microchip instead of a magnetic strip or stripe. Some US cards have both for international acceptance. Somebody traveled and bought me a wallet, but it was a lot of force. I was just wondering why the person didn't give me the money under the conditions that we live in this country. I know say the money will go far, but he was not explaining to me the detail of the card, that this card, if you have the card, nobody can pick your card. I'm like, oh, then I remember that I watched a clip one time of somebody who was in a particular restaurant eating, and they were trying to demonstrate how people can actually steal people's personal information and transact with it. And some guy had some particular card reader. The card reader had a way of reading people's cards, and it was not really cheap. It was just a magnetic something. So he explained to me that if my cards are inside that particular wallet, nobody should do that kind of thing. So I'm like, okay, cool. I'll keep that card until I begin to get those American Express kind of cards. It will make sense, and I'll get them very soon. So typical elements on the back of the card are like that black. There's a black line, right? Magnetic strip containing encoded data required to authenticate, authorize, and process transactions. Some cards have one black line at the back, right? Some of this information are there. Okay. Then you have things like your CAV, your CID, CVC, or CVV, right? Those numbers that after when you are doing transaction, they ask you to put this number. They are just abbreviations. All these abbreviations are names for card security codes for different payment brands. Okay. So those are the things that are contained in every card. Now, regulatory compliance, key technical elements in regulations you should consider: data isolation, password management, and key management. Now, most regulations dictate several key elements, and a penetration tester should pay attention to them and verify them during access to make sure the organization is compliant. So your data isolation focuses on organization complying with data isolation strategy. What this means is that with respect to implementing any kind of data storage or data transmission as it regards card payment processes, how do they handle it? Okay, the goal is to implement a completely isolated network that includes all systems involved in payment and payment card processes. Password management, of course, certain regulations that mandate solid password management strategy. For example, organizations must not use vendor supply default for system password and security parameters. Let me say this. This is, I don't know how this will sit with some people. A lot of people use Google Authenticator. Everybody, right? Are you saying it's bad? Well, it's not bad, though, but it's just that password, as it were. Your password is now resident somewhere. Some other person is the one who is generating certain passwords for you. Some accounts, once you begin to use Google Authenticator, the moment you are attempting to create passwords for a particular site, maybe it's a site you are registering or enrolling for, it suggests to you certain kind of password. Sometimes this password are even stored on your browser history. It's stored in your browser, right? So there are certain regulations that require that passwords are actually solid password management, not just what's it called now? Vendor supplied defaults or system generated passwords for the purpose of security. So this requirement also extends far beyond its title and enters the realm of configuration management. In addition, most of these regulations mandate specific implementation standards, including password length, password complexity, and session timeout, as well as the use of multi-factor authentication. You all know that it's become a main thing today, particularly multi-factor. Somebody was saying it's two-factor. Well, I say we grew from two-factor to multi-factor. So more than one factor, right? So with respect to length of password, we are told that password should be at least a minimum of 8 characters. Hey, it should be 10. Hey, come on, anything more than that. In short, we are actually growing from a point where we don't deal with these things called passwords anymore. We're dealing with passphrases. So actually, what's the idea? It makes it a bit tougher and harder to guess or to even break, whether you're using brute force attack or dictionary attack, right? And then the complexity of passwords today have been such that we've been told that your password should not contain just one character. It should contain an uppercase, at least an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, special character, and so on. And the reason is so that it makes the option of how do I put it now? Identity to check for or to break the password more complex. Okay. Then there's a key management, is a value that specifies what part of the algorithm to apply and in what order, as well as the variables to impute. To appreciate this, you could actually look at certain content under cyber security, right? Where we focus on the different types of key management, public key, private key, with respect to cryptography, that is largely. So it is critical to use a strong key that cannot be discovered and to protect the key from unauthorized access. Protecting the key is generally referred to as key management. And it's captured under NIST. We talked about NIST yesterday. It's a standard recommendation for key management, part 1, revision 4. All of these documents just captures it. So please look at it. Best practices for key management is captured there. Application specific key management guidance, which provides guidance when using cryptographic features of current systems. Those are all captured there as well. So key management is knowing when to use a public key and a private key, what makes it symmetrical or asymmetrical key exchange. So there's what is called a PKI, public key infrastructure. It captures all of these things and how they are used. So there might be some certain local restrictions. You should be aware of local restrictions when you are hired to perform penetration testing. For instance, you may be traveling abroad to a country that is not yours, and they have specific limitations in that country. Local laws that may restrict whether you can perform some tasks as a penetration tester or not. There are certain kind of jobs you can't get as long as you're a foreigner in some countries, no matter the certifications you have. Except, of course, you naturalize. And after that, after a while, you may get some of those jobs and all. So penetration testing laws vary from country to country. That's so much as in very, very valid. Okay, so there are cases of people who, IT guys who leave the shores of this land, going to other shores and hoping to get this kind of job, but never getting it. They have all the certifications, but there are certain kind of jobs they expose them to, not because they are racist, but it's more or less being able to just ensure that the integrity of the practices there are handled by people they consider loyal, one, people they can also lay their hands on and be able to track. Because any foreigner can up and leave tomorrow after doing some stuff. Plus, it's also possible that he's considered a spy from another country wanting to access some things in that country with reference to geopolitics, that is. Okay, so some penetration testers have been accused and even arrested for allegedly violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of America, right? Section 1030A5, subsection B. Subsection B, 5B. You must always have clear documentation from your client, and that's the person who hired you, indicating that you have permission to perform the testing. Clearly, some of these limitations and considerations may have a direct impact to your contract and your statement of work, or what we call scope of work, or what we call terms of reference. So statement of work, terms of reference are just the same term that capture different things. During your pre-engagement task, you should identify testing constraints, including tool restrictions. There are certain tools that are not allowed in certain countries. For Cisco devices, the moment you power them up, when it is loading, it shows you a clear law saying that, look, cryptographic stuff are not supposed to be shipped outside America. But if they are shipped outside America, then of course, be sure that there are certain laws in your country that apply, or maybe causing that particular equipment to be used. So it's also part of what restricts certain shipment of some things to some part of the world. Some things are not allowed. For example, they are manufactured in a country like, say, China. There are some countries that they don't allow certain things to go into. Some countries have a restriction to things coming from China. Some countries have restrictions for things coming from America, and so on. It's just part of their geopolitics. I want to identify the rules or the legislations or perhaps even the regulations that cover all of this. So a few examples of constraints that you might face during the penetration testing engagement include certain areas and technologies that cannot be tested due to operational limitations. For instance, you might be able to launch specific SQL injection attacks, as doing so might corrupt. You might not be able to. Doing so might corrupt a production database. Technology that might be specific to certain organizations being tested, or maybe not even applicable in certain countries. Limitation of skill set, this is where they nail a lot of people, right? They just tell you, you could actually be coming from a country, but they don't know how to say. They'll say, you don't have the skill sets required, right? Limitations of known exploits. This is another key issue. Now, you must be exposed to a lot of possible exploits that actually exist. There's a site which I'm going to tell you about. Write it down. You might want to go and check. It's called Talos, Talos. It's owned by Cisco. It's an on-grid. Is it like a threat database? It shows you the threats that are happening in every part of the world as we speak, right? Like an on-the-go detail and all of those. So it gives you some idea as to what to look out for. Now, it is open to some degree to people who are not signed, who don't have any form of service level agreement. By that, I mean, if you have not purchased some devices and just want to perhaps have an account with them, you pay some amount. But the moment you buy devices from Cisco, and depending on the level of access you have, or level of payment you've done, you have access to some levels of information regarding threats that happen around the world. Apart from that, generally, you can go there and just check and perhaps use other tools to research and find out the behavior of some of those kind of threats. So that way you have information about exploits that are known, right? Systems that are categorized as out of scope. Remember, we talked about scope, an area that you have permission to deal with or to test. And so certain systems are categorized as out of scope because of the critical nature, right? Or known performance problem that particular system has. Okay? So you should clearly communicate any technical constraints with the appropriate stakeholder of the organization. Remember that step number 4 of the things I told us earlier requires that you identify your stakeholders, right? So these stakeholders could include people who work for you, people who you hire, people who are in the legal team, security team, IT team, and the rest of them. You might also face different local government requirements, such as privacy requirements of GDPR, right? And we have one, the Consumer Privacy Act of California, which is a state law focused on privacy. Now, why this is a big thing is if you observe when you perhaps read books or watch movies, you notice that certain laws are applicable in certain states within the US. And some people, there are some driving laws, there are some age laws at some places 18, other places 19, other places 16, other places to show you how crazy it is. Someone can actually study law in a particular state but cannot practice in another state, except the person sits for their bar exam and passes. And other states, no matter how you do it, you cannot practice. So that's why they're discussing most of these things. For the part where we live, it is what goes. Where Bele face, I can just go to Akwa Ibom and do anyhow, come back to Bauchi and we're good. No wahala. But then these things are actually things we're hoping that we can actually make better as we advance. Okay, so service level agreement is another thing. Legal concepts, very important. Looking at the various steps, right? Legal concepts are very, very key. And this is usually with regards to getting permission to do informal penetration testing. There are several legal concepts that you must know. Number one, we call that SLA, Service Level Agreement, which is more or less a document, right, that captures the expectations or that also spells out the constraints that relate to one or more of minimum or maximum performance issues. Things like, let's say, quality, the timeline, things also regarding maybe warranty, right? Costs of any of the penetration testing services. So before we use any of those things, documents need to be signed. You can see that it's becoming a big thing. It's not just having to have some certifications and then know how to do pen testing. Now, as it stands, as the time goes by, for people, because this is more or less like giving somebody permission to invade the privacy. So the person must have proper documentation, and then there must be record that shows this person is, to a large degree, compliant to certain things. Should he default or should she default, then we can actually hold the person liable, right? Then confidentiality is another matter. Of course, remember that confidentiality is one of the legs, the triads for cybersecurity. We have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Then there's the fourth one called non-repudiation. But confidentiality focuses on identifying that only people who have authorization to access certain information can have it. So if something is termed confidential, it means that no, it's not meant for everybody. There are certain people who have access to it and it stays that way. You must discuss and agree on handling of confidential data. For example, if you're able to find passwords, these are very limited, small things. So what if you find somebody's private pictures? What do you do with such? What if you find someone's sensitive data? Say maybe things about their banks, their financial records, and all of these things. What's going to happen to that, right? What will be the proper way to communicate how you handle this? This must be stated out, must be spelled out, right? Should you delete? Should you keep them every time you finish a penetration testing engagement? Here's the rule: delete any records from your system. Now, some people actually take it with them and cause trouble. This is where they just realize the person just lost for night. They don't know where in day. You know, there's some kind of places once you get exposed to some information, so you can't leave except they compromise you. If you know it, it's better you don't know it. So just be certain what you are walking into. Then there's also what is called a statement of work, which is what I called earlier as a term of reference. Is a legal concept. It's a document that specifies the activity to be performed during the penetration testing. It's not different from term of reference. So it's just that with regards to penetration testing, it is called the statement of work, right? So it is a document that specifies the activity to be performed during the penetration testing engagement. It can be used to define some of the following elements. One, project timelines, including the report delivery schedule. What are the deliverables we should get from you? How often should you report with regard to penetration testing? Number two, the scope of the work to be performed, right? Again, what devices or what services or what infrastructure, what software or applications are we dealing with? The location of the work. Is it in the Northeast? Is it in the Southwest? And so on, right? Special technical and non-technical requirements. Ethical things, right? Report writing, being good with maybe Microsoft Office or perhaps Excel. All of this is stated there. Payment schedule. This is where I like this one. Let's discuss what's going to happen. Are you giving me 35% mobilization? or are you giving me 80%, or I pay me upfront? Either which way, discuss it. And at time once you are done, pay. There's no long thing. There are miscellaneous items that may not be part of the main negotiations, but that need to be listed and tracked because they could pose problem during the overall engagement. It's all part of what is contained in the statement of work. It can be a standalone document or can be part of the entire agreement, right? Which includes the tools that we are using, right? The scope, the duration, and all of those things, the stakeholders, and everything, which is called the master service agreement, right? So the master service agreements are contracts that can be used to quickly negotiate the work to be performed. When the master agreement is in place, the same terms do not have to be renegotiated. Every time you perform work for a customer, you don't need to renegotiate it anymore. They are especially beneficial when you perform a penetration testing and you know that you will be rehired on a recurring basis to perform additional tests. So more or less like, since we now know your competence or competencies, as the case may be, and you've been able to deliver, and we know that your track record is clean, you can always engage your services based on that. Except, of course, there's some, maybe our organization has upped its requirement, in which case you might be notified. If you have this certification, then cool. Otherwise, we'll find some other person, right? And there's a non-disclosure agreement, very important. Part of what, there are two things that are supposed to be documents that when we get there, I'll give it to you guys. There's an NDA typically saying, don't talk about this matter. It's a discussion between two of you guys, right? Just explains that, look, you know what, no matter what happens, you are not expected to disclose, right? Confidential materials are here. There's some information that you have we cannot talk about, right? Some knowledge that you came across while working here, you don't discuss it outside. Me, I can talk. Me, I can't keep quiet. Then that means you cannot work, right? There are certain things that you have to look the other way, and it's looking at it professional. Now, in this case, moral doesn't come in. I'm allowing you to have access to my private sectors. So you will definitely find certain things that are not supposed to be disclosed, certain things that need to be protected, right? They could be unilateral, right? They could be bilateral, it could be multilateral. Meaning, in the case of unilateral, it is only one party, right? Only one party discloses certain information to the other party. So I'll tell you on a need-to-know basis. Bilateral means that it's mutual. We discuss. It's a two-way. In which case, both parties share sensitive information with each other, right? It's like a counseling session. Then there's multilateral, means that we're more than one party. But either which way, no matter what happens in this case, we're not expected to disclose. You don't talk about it on social media. You don't discuss it with your wife or your spouse. It is based on the discussion that we need to have. So again, contracts are very important, must be drafted by a lawyer. In these days, I expect that even if you don't have a skill in reading law, if you don't have anything, one of the things that's very important as a document in a pen testing environment or engaging a service is because it specifies terms of agreement, how you will get paid, and documentation processes, services that will be performed in the event that you default, what's going to happen, right? You cannot remove personal identifying information. All of these contracts are there. Like typical contract. In the event that you come across this, all of this is somewhat like it should be part of your statement of work, right? But then these are on the document. So very important to be handled. So let's move forward. Okay, still talking about contract, more or less the same thing. Cloud service providers, internet service providers, right? More or less just you sign, we sign, and then we know what we're up against, and that document is binding. In the event that one of us is defaulting, right, we can actually take it to law, to the court of law. You might want to add disclaimers, right, as well as the final report. For example, you can specify that you conducted penetration testing on applications and systems that existed as of a clearly stated date. From this date to this date, I did the work. Cybersecurity threats are always changing and new vulnerabilities are discovered daily. So I paid you 200,000 naira. You're supposed to do pen testing. And this guy did the job and left. And 2 weeks later, we had problem. Well, sir, this is as at the time I was paid. The threats that were available, which I tested and saw and made you know about, were as stated in the document. You're looking at a date post my activity. I don't think that has anything to do with me. You should be able to specify that the penetration testing report is intended to only provide documentation for your client that covers a particular time frame, right? So the disclaimer should say that your penetration testing report cannot and does not protect against personal or business loss. It's like cars parked at owner's risk. We'll create a parking lot for you, but if you park your car there, well, don't come and say we should pay you for the car. Okay, so that's that about disclaimer. So there's a lab for that. So let's dive into the part that I want to dwell on before we conclude. Most likely, I'm going to skip the last part for you to deal with, but I want to look at explaining the importance of scope and organizational or customer requirements. This is with respect to this particular topic. I think we talked about OSWAP yesterday. We talked about NIST. We talked about those are the two we talked about. There's a part I'm trying to look for. I'll get back there shortly. Don't worry, I'll get back. Okay, rules are rules of engagement. Okay, all right. Sorry, I'm going to go back. Don't worry. Just want to identify a particular. Yeah, okay. Governance. Where did I throw that away? I don't know what has happened to my slide. I don't know whether I took that out. Okay, let's just see. I was going to talk about a particular aspect. Okay, let's go ahead. So in the module we dealt with yesterday, which was Introduction to Ethical Hacking and Pen Testing, we learned about the importance of the written permission to attack and the different penetration testing standards and methodologies, such as the PTES Penetration Testing Execution Standard, or the OSSTM, the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual, the Information System and Security Assessment Framework, ISAF, and the different guidance document from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and also the Open Web Application Security Project, OSWAP. You also learned about the different environmental considerations, let's say network, application, and cloud environments. We looked at all of this yesterday. In this section, you will learn about rules of engagement, target list, in-scope asset, and how to validate the scope of an engagement. So the rule of engagement document, remember I said that this must be stated out. I think that was point number 3 or so? This is where you establish rules to guide the testing, including what time of the day people need to work, whether it's night, and so on, right? So the rule of engagement document specifies the condition under which the security penetration testing engagement will be conducted. You need to document and agree upon these rules of engagement conditions with the client or an appropriate stakeholder. For example, what we have here, here are elements of it. Testing timeline. Is it going to be 3 weeks? Right? You could go ahead and do a chart, a Gantt chart for it, which lists when you're starting what needs to be done, right? Could even do an Excel sheet, could even do a PowerPoint, more or less something that actually reveals your timeline. Number 2, location of the testing. Is it going to be done at the company's headquarters or the regional headquarters? You know, these are examples. In this case, it's company headquarters in Raleigh, right? Then time window of the testing, time of the day. Is it going to be 9 a.m. to 5 p.m.? Which of the day? Weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? Then preferred method of communication, final report and weekly status update meetings. Do we do meetings regularly? Fiscal meeting, Zoom meeting, or let's say fiscal meeting, virtual meetings, mails. Do we have, like, let's say a WhatsApp, you know, could it be, you know, any of those kind of things? So you agree upon them. This is how I want to engage, right? Now, the security controls that could potentially detect or prevent testing, right? What do you have in your network? You know, you have your firewall implemented, and typically it's been designed to identify such kind of stuff, you know. So do we turn them off? Do we leave them on? Do we test those as well? Now, you want to also identify IP addresses or networks from which testing will originate. So what we do, we can create what some people call honeypot, or create maybe an isolated virtual local area network within that place. And so we're launching attacks from there into your network so that it is within a controlled environment, whichever. Then types of allowed or disallowed tests. What do you want? Different tests are there. Web applications, these are SQL injections, what different kind of pen testing you want to do. Are they allowed? Is it in the development stage? Is it app one? So is it stage development? All of this stuff. Just list them. These are just like examples of what needs to be done. So this is like a Gantt chart explaining more or less a breakdown of what needs to be done and all of the time. So this is just like an example. So typically we're saying communicate what you want to achieve. Now, remember scoping, right? Identifying what needs to be engaged. Scoping is one of the most important elements of the pre-engagement tasks with any penetration testing engagement. You not only have to carefully identify and document all system application and networks that will be tested, but also you determine any specific requirements and qualifications needed to perform the test. Now, the broader the scope of the penetration testing engagement, the more skills and requirements that will be needed. Your scope and related document or documentation must include information about what types of network will be tested. In addition to IP ranges, you must document any wireless network or service set identifiers or SSIDs that you are allowed to not or allowed to test, right? Some people are attempting to annotate. Please, it's making the screen look somehow, right? Except, of course, if it's your children that are doing this one. I would ask that you please find a way to unannotate so that our screen can look better. Remember that you're going to be looking at this later. You may also be hired to perform an assessment of modern applications using different application platforms or programming interfaces, your APIs. So all of these are also things you need to identify, right? So these are types of API documentations that can be used as part of your scope. You may want to do SOAP, that's Simple Object Access Protocol. This is an API that relies on XML and related schemas. Basically, having a good reference, right, of this API support would be beneficial. Okay, so again, this is not just how do I put this now? As we advance, it will become clearer to us all that hacking, or what we know as hacking is way much more serious than this, and a good idea will be to understand. A good way to approach it would be to understand what the conversations that happen within a network is. I said this yesterday, let me repeat it. Typically, the structure of the internet or the network as it is today, the architecture is such that services are hosted somewhere, somebody makes a request. So what are the interactions? For the various services that you use, there are various protocols that guard and guide them. Understanding these protocols can help assist in knowing what to deal with, so that if you are dealing with a specific thing, you know what it is exactly you're dealing with. You can imagine bringing a farmer into a theater, or taking a surgeon into the farm, right? You can argue that, say, the surgeon can farm, but there are certain specifics that are actually, based on the field. So it's very, very important. So another type of API documentation that's in there, the Swagger, is based on Open API, sorry. Is a modern framework of application programming interface and development that is now the basis of open API specification. These documents are used in representational state transfer, or what we call REST API. And REST is actually software that has a design style that guides development of architecture of web services, right? So it could be REST or RESTful. Okay. So we also have web service description language. This is an XML language that is used to document the functionality of web services. So these are documentations that help. So you'd realize that you need knowledge from different fields. There's a network aspect of the knowledge. There's also the web aspect of the knowledge. There's the programming aspect of the knowledge, which is the scripting aspect of every knowledge required for pen testing. So I said this yesterday, let me repeat it again. Most of pen testers in this part of the world just use tools to test without knowing what the tools are made of, without really even identifying what exactly it is testing. Okay, so that's what we're attempting to communicate here. And there's GraphQL, that's a query language for APIs. It is also a server-side runtime for executing queries such as requests made from servers, right? Then there's WADL, which is Web Application Description Language for describing web application. Then there's also Service Description Language. These are different application programming interfaces. We also have your software development kit. Is a dev kit, which is like a collection of software development tools that can be used to interact and also deploy certain software framework within an operating system, a hardware platform, as the case may be. So some of these applications are SDKs. The source code access. This is more or less allowing me have access to the heart of your organization's perhaps applications, as it were, or services. Then examples of application requests. In most cases, you'll be able to reveal context by using web application testing with tools like proxies, burp sites, and the rest of them. System and network architectural design is also another support resource that you might need to obtain from the organization that hired you in the event that they have all of the services running. And so you see, there needs to be discussion with the people who design the network. Now, one of our issues here again is the fact that the guy who designed the network, we quarreled with him, so he has gone. He built the network or perhaps built the service, and we had payment issues. We just quarreled and we say he's a young man. These young people have problem. They are not patient. So the guy leaves. Then we get some other person, and the person tells you, I can do it for better. I don't know if you've seen that picture of I can do it for less. When you charge something, let's say it's 1,150K, then some other person tells you I can do it for less and charges you 150, then brings you a caricature of the work. So there's a lot of ethical things that need to be considered when dealing with this. Some organizations don't have all these details. I bet you some of you are perhaps even getting exposed to some of the details for the first time. It's okay. That's because of your perspective or perhaps because of your background. Your background might be in networks. Your background might be in web development. Some of you are familiar with it because you are in DevOps, right, which is a very new sphere. Some people are just in scripting or programming, as it were. Some could just be in cybersecurity. Some are just in hardware and so on, which is okay. Okay. Right. So I'll need to end the class very shortly because my battery is beginning to give me a lot of issues. It's beginning to drain, not an issue. So remember we talked about scope creep yesterday. Is usually when somebody begins to go outside the scope, which typically will happen if the scope is not defined. Okay, so there's a need to have scopes defined. Very, very important. Many security firms suffer from scope creep and are unsuccessful because they have no idea how to identify when the problem starts or how to react to it, right? There's also important documentation you should have with regards to physical location where penetration test will be done, as well as the DNS that handles this. You want to have fully qualified domain names for that particular application, or perhaps subdomains that are available there. You want to test them and all. So there's something. Let me do this and then quickly read something out to us, and then let us. Okay, cool. So let's look at it this way. Situations in which a scope creep might occur. Management is changed, right? Like I said earlier, somebody just gets upset and leaves the project, takes off. Non-technical and technical elements, usually ineffective identification of what technical and or non-technical elements that are required for pen testing. Poor communication is another reason why you may have scope creep, where somebody actually goes ahead. Now, typically, right, the person may go ahead outside the scope, perhaps because it wasn't clearly defined. Now, it doesn't always start as a bad situation. Could be maybe somebody who is satisfied with work, and the person you're engaged, ask you to perform additional tasks. Okay, man, this guy, you do well. You do well, Lou. Can you try this guy? Can you try? So typically if they engage your service, please define it for every time you're asked to do something, right? Ensure that it is within your agreement, right? Within your scope. If they require you to attempt any other scope, please, it should be documented. If you initially engaged with your client after a request for proposal, and additional work is needed that was not part of the request for proposal, or is not inside your work plan, your term of reference, you should ask for a new one and then have it signed and agreed. Very important, right? So one of the things you want to do is first questions. What is the entity or individual's need for the report? In terms of writing a report, validating the scope of all of an engagement, you want to ensure that you report back, and we identify that this report should be done at an agreed interval, right? Who's the primary recipient of the report? Who should I report to? Sometimes you may notice when you go to some place to work, everybody is your guy. Hey, call me, I do this. Let me send it to my mail. Who should I report to? Let me know. If somebody is asking me to send a report based on the terms of reference, if the person is not the scope of the work, the person is not the one who taught, then there's no need to send a person report. Number two, purpose of the goal. What is the main purpose of the penetration test? What are we trying to achieve? Are we testing whether we should continue the application or want to discontinue? Then responsibility and authority. Who's the individual or the business that is responsible to make decisions? Like in the event that I want something, who should I meet? Management, supervisor, as the case may be. So who should I report the address to, or address the report to? Is it the chief information security officer, or is it the chief information officer, or is it the chief technical officer? Is it the information security manager? Let's know who, right? Then others with access to the report. Who will have access so that we don't have something tweaked? Let me tell you guys this story. I don't know how proper it is. I know about somebody was telling me about a particular organization, right? And that so it's a religious organization, and they do offerings. There's this thing that they do in some of those organizations, like they take offerings. So they introduce some digital ways to receive it. And for some reason, some guy had actually, it's just crazy how people do stuff. In the, I don't know how to explain this now, but they were diverting funds, more or less, right? So that when it was supposed to go to the particular organization's account, then they distribute it like that until somebody raised concern, and they were hoping to sack the guy who was doing the job. And for some reason, some guys who were within the organization started revolting. So I said this yesterday, but Chingari said Dangari, or Korotonja for Longwa, or the EDF for Longwa, right? The thing where they chop plant and inside the plant today. So usually, sometimes you want to find out who should access a certain report before they can change it. It might be changed before it gets to the chief executive officer, right? So you should have proper documentation, answer to the following questions: relevant stakeholders, communication process, timing of interaction, emergency contacts. What do we do in these cases? Who do I contact? What's the communication? How do we communicate with stakeholders? Mail, WhatsApp, and the rest of them. So let me end today's class by trying to explain to you these three things. We'll call that governance, risk, and compliance. What exactly is this? Because what we're talking about here actually captures all of those. So this is like a document, right? I'm going to stop here. Please, the rest of it, you're going to have to read up, validating the scope of engagement. Let me quickly do this, and then we'll be done so that we get to save some time. I have it written out, so I'm going to attempt to use certain notes that I made while I was studying earlier for the class. So governance, risk, and compliance is an approach, right, that organizations usually have that helps them align the business objectives to regulations, right? So it's very important. Now, the three of them are combined, but let me attempt to explain three of them individually. For example, when we talk about governance, we're looking at it in the context of an organization and penetration testing. It focuses on frameworks, policies, and structures that guide and control an organization. That's what we talked about earlier, that different organizations have their own governance scope, right? And there are different things that cover them. And the purpose here is to be able to establish accountability, transparency, and ethics, right? So that way operations are done with reference to certain guidelines, right? It provides direction and oversight. That way it ensures that organization leadership and resources or their actions are aligned to deliver a goal, right? Then we have how do I put it? I talked about governance, governance, risk, and compliance. So with respect to risk, let me attempt saying this. Now, risk or risk management, as it were, is the process of identifying a threat, assessing that threat, and controlling that particular threat. Now, whether it's the threat in itself is a risk, right? It can stem from various sources. It could be from inside, it could be from outside, and it could also be one, financial issues, legal issues, technology issues, or natural causes like disaster, earthquake, or rainfall and all. Very important. And the purpose of being able to identify these risks is to ensure that risk management is there to be able to minimize the impact of any kind of risk that the organization may face, right? Then lastly, we have compliance. This is, of course, very straightforward. Compliance involves adhering to laws. So we have laws which are part of the governance, right? Now, this time around, we must ensure or enforce compliance, typically ensuring that regulations, standards, and ethical practices that apply to that specific organization, whether it is health, financial, banking, and the rest of them, are complied with. So it helps organizations to meet legal requirements. Otherwise, people can sue. Okay, so the primary purpose of compliance is to protect the organization. One, protect you, who's the ethical hacker. Two, then protect also the client that they work with or that they work for. So typically, any form of litigations can be avoided as long as compliance to framework, right, is there. And this is what makes you an ethical hacker or makes your work ethical with respect to your environment, the organization, or the scope that they engage you for. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's what we're going to be stopping for today. The reason is because my battery will soon go off and it will be rude to just end the class midway without really getting conclude. So I apologize for this, for the time. Most of this is we're going to make up for it once we are balanced. Like I said yesterday, we're taking off. So please accommodate some of my excesses, as it were, with respect to the things that we need to do. Right. So we'll be dealing with the rest of this. Please read them, and please let's see, because every other thing from this point on are stuff that we can actually talk about. Yeah. So bottom, that's the end of the module. But if I continue, they're not much anymore. What is left is not much. Please read up and please throw in questions. And I would really love to have a very interactive session in the group. Ask questions within what we're dealing with, and ask tough questions, things that can generate a lot of mind staggering or mind triggering responses. Thank you all very much for your time today. I hope it was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for being part of today's class. All right, so what do we, so let me stop to share my slide and perhaps end the recording. The recording can be ended now, sir.